They mocked her for being single at 40 beneath chandeliers that preferred gossip to light. But when the most desired duke crossed the floor and asked for her first dance, he chose a verb rarer than rescue: respect. The room paused between a violin's inhale and the scrape of shoes, and in that hush he staked a visible price, standing beside, not ahead, knowing morning would invoice him in invitations and headlines. She accepted without lowering her gaze or raising her chin, because dignity can be both soft and immovable, and even a single dance can open a door everyone insists is stuck. Rain timed their steps on the panes, a metronome for restrained beginnings, while silence carried more oxygen than any speech he could have offered to soothe a crowd that thrives on shortage. By the last note, a rumor already had a name, but her name had a new witness with rank, consequence, and the discipline to risk being unwelcome in rooms that once greeted him first. The music began as courteously as any lie, a line of polite notes laid like lace to distract from how quickly whispers learn to travel when chandeliers repeat them in crystal. She stood by the tall windows, where rain rehearsed an honest paragraph on glass, 40 and unhurried, one hand resting on a folded fan as if it marked a chapter she did not intend to skip for anyone's convenience. The first laugh arrived improperly, not as laughter, but as a thread snapping near a seam, and several heads turned together the way a flock turns, many eyes, one intention. An aunt translated cruelty into etiquette for a niece who had asked nothing, and a matron suggested seasons should be obeyed, or the harvest would be strange, as if months were magistrates and a woman a defendant with poor counsel. She did not lower her gaze because she had never learned how to rehearse shame on command, and habit kept her breathing at a tempo that refused to rent itself to the room's appetite. Across the floor, the Duke watched with the attention of a draftsman measuring balance before ink touches paper, saying nothing, not for lack of speech, but out of care for the first word being an act. The orchestra shifted to a set designed for approach and retreat, elegant disagreement disguised as dance. And the pattern itself betrayed the room's craving for hierarchy, labeled as harmony. A gentleman with a new waistcoat and an old idea installed himself 2 paces away and arranged his smile into the shape men wear when they intend to sound kind while being exact about their contempt. "Perhaps tonight you'll be less particular," he said, and several fans paused mid-flutter because unkindness performs beautifully when given a rhythm section. She answered by returning the fan to its ribbon, a lining clasped a glove seam with the exactness of a refusal that does not audition for applause, and the room felt the conversation end without hearing the word no. He attempted retreat with borrowed dignity and left less than he thought, and she allowed silence to occupy the space an apology should have taken, which is often the fairest distribution of air. It was then the Duke crossed the floor without hurry, the path as straight as a sentence determined to be understood, and his arrival read as risk not spectacle, the difference measured in breath rather than steps. He stopped at a distance that honored choice and asked for the first dance, the phrasing free of entitlement and rescue alike, the tone designed to make courtesy carry more weight than show. Everything paused, the bow arms, the arithmetic of who mattered and why. The habit of watching women learn publicly, because nothing in the evening had prepared the room to see a man with options choose precision over performance. She met his gaze long enough to verify the offer was partnership, not theater, then inclined her head in consent clean enough to resist being misquoted by morning. When their hands almost touched, heat did not rush in. A steadier coolness settled, the composure that arrives when a test begins, and a person remembers that breathing is a right, not a favor. They moved like 2 careful readers advancing on soft ground, and the space between their words worked harder than any line spoken loudly for an audience that mistrusts subtlety. He spoke first of weather, the faithful saboteur of parties, and she answered with a book whose spine had cracked from honest use, a failure she preferred to any shine that lied. Around them, the dance corrected the room's assumptions in small figures: approach without enclosing, retreat without abandoning, return without claiming. The grammar of grown people negotiating without witnesses they did not invite. Someone laughed at the wrong beat and sounded unmusical. Someone else rescued the silence with a look that meant, wait until we can classify this. Classification is the room's favorite sport. On the turn that aligns faces, he said, I didn't come to contradict the room, leaving the line long enough to seem complete before adding, only to counter its arithmetic, and the floorboards felt newly measured. She considered whether he had earned his taller posture and answered, Equations improve when we decide what counts, and their shared quiet afterward functioned as permission rather than absence. Near the doors, a young woman who collected other people's moments for later found that this one would not stick to her needle. Dignity is a slippery thread when handled with clumsy hands. The piece neared its end. He did not hurry to flatten the evening into a simple story, because simple stories behave badly in rooms that dislike evidence. Near the final bow, he placed the sentence he had saved for when the room could not mishear it. Choosing a verb as carpenters choose joints, by what weight it must bear. I stand beside Emin, he said, not loud enough to audition for heroism, but clear enough to require recalibration. And this is how courage keeps from being rented. She did not thank him. Gratitude would have made a gift of something that was not generosity but alignment, so she sealed the exchange with a nod that recorded itself without sparkle. The murmur returned in a new key, as if the room were retuning around a note it had not rehearsed, and in that altered pitch, the arithmetic lost a digit it had once counted on. They separated with deliberate ease, leaving behind a fact that would not dissolve under morning light. The first dance had cost him, and the cost had purchased her nothing she had asked for, only a witness on her terms. At the threshold, where couples decide whether to pretend nothing happened, he paused only long enough to offer a neutral coordinate for tomorrow, a portrait studio at 10, where light, not gossip, decides what can be seen, and left the door to the rest ajar. Morning laid a pale sheet over the square, impartial and exacting, and the portrait studio opened its shutters to a rain-washed light that made color tell the truth it could afford. She arrived with a friend who wanted a miniature and took a chair near the correcting mirror, content to be an observer in a room where faces were studied as work rather than sport. The painter bowed and returned to his palette, the air smelling of linen, oil, and patience. The arithmetic of mixing tones until a skin remembered its temperature, without flattery. On the far wall leaned a parliament of canvases, officers in uniforms. Ladies posed with a hand upon a book they had not been allowed to finish, and one half-done portrait that looked like a thought interrupted. She examined the modest mirror used to check proportions, finding not a judge, but a task. Correct the angle, quiet the stray hair. Decide where dignity places the chin today. 40 had taught her that some days dignity is heavy and must be carried. On others, it is light and must be protected from being borrowed by the wrong story. The Duke entered with the discretion of a man who prefers to learn a room's sentence before adding a word, and left his rank in the corridor the way one leaves an umbrella at the door, useful elsewhere, inconvenient here. He greeted the painter by name and asked after the light, not the fee, placing respect in a practical question, which is where respect does its best work. She did not step forward or back, only watched how easily a title can either crowd a small room or become invisible when discipline is genuine. The painter, warmed by being treated as a craftsman and not a prop, spoke of composition, the honest trickery of deciding where the eye should land first and what it should earn later. The Duke studied the half-done canvas longer than politeness demands, posture quiet as if loudness could smudge paint, and when he spoke his tone kept the reflection still. This one refuses to be flattered, he said. The painter smiled the smile of a man whose work has been seen and agreed that refusal is sometimes the only way a likeness keeps its name. Her friend tried a helpful laugh, the sort that fills space when thought grows audible, but the room preferred the hush, and the laugh declined to linger. She approached the unfinished portrait and found eyes left unresolved on purpose, not incomplete, but waiting for the subject to decide before the painter committed, a courtesy she admired. At the correcting mirror, her own face returned to her with the even honesty daylight offers, neither begging nor forgiving, and she thought how candlelight can make a lie look polished. He did not look at her directly, not out of shyness, but care for the painter's task, because attention mishandled is a tool that mars a surface. He asked whether mornings favored truth or afternoons warmth. The painter said mornings for truth, afternoons for forgiveness, and everyone understood without explanation. Young patron entered without knocking, trailing the smile of someone who likes to be seen paying attention, and congratulated the painter too loudly on a commission not yet earned. His gaze slid over her with the passing scrutiny of those who have never held anything heavy for long, and he arranged his words like lace, intricate, useless. How brave, he said, to sit without a mother or fiancé to approve a pose. The painter's brush stopped mid-air. Lies often travel wrapped in compliments. She considered answering and didn't, not from fear but thrift. Some replies furnish other people's rooms, and she had no intention of buying furniture for strangers. The Duke turned only enough to tidy the air and corrected the premise without enlarging the scene. "It is not bravery to stand in one's competence," he said, voice low enough to avoid creating spectators. "In portraiture as in life, approval improves nothing if the subject is already whole," he added, the last word placed like a weight where a frame would creak without it. The patron met a wall higher than his stride and retreated to safer boasts. The painter resumed, grateful for a room returned to its work. She did not thank the Duke, because gratitude would have misnamed the act, correction not rescue, and misnaming invites future injuries. He accepted the unowed thanks fluently, which relieved her in a way she had not budgeted for, interest earned on restraint. The painter asked whether anyone wished to sit for a study while the light behaved. The Duke declined and, without looking at her, asked whether the lady preferred to remain unrecorded or to supervise the truth. "The truth requires a clean table and a window," she said, and the painter gestured to both, making room not for her face but for her say. They spoke of angles and interruptions, of how hands tell when faces are trained, and of how a tilt can turn judgment into attention without moving a single feature. The patron's cousin appeared with a half-question designed to harvest mischief. The Duke did not bar him entry because prevention would have lent drama to what did not merit it. Instead, he set a paperweight on gossip. "It is rare to watch firmness keep from hardening," he said, and even the cousin heard that the virtue, not the woman, had been named. The cousin nodded the nod of someone handed an answer to a question he had hoped to ask, and, robbed of hinge, left with nothing portable. The painter gave the unresolved eye a direction neither flattering nor defiant, only attentive, and she left the mirror at peace, the way one leaves a door open on purpose, so a room can learn trust. The Duke paid not for a sitting but for time stolen by interruptions, accuracy in different clothing, and no one was embarrassed by the transaction. On the threshold, the patron returned for a second attempt at tidiness. The room, now fluent in refusing stagecraft, did not make space for it. Outside, rain thinned to suggestion, encouraging errands. She realized a single sentence said in the right tone can spare 100 future explanations. He matched her pace for half a street and then allowed the day to separate them, confident that conversations earn themselves better when no one calls them promises. Behind them, the painter looked at the corrected eye with some satisfaction and decided to leave it awake, a testimony that mornings, handled properly, make expensive companions. By afternoon, the studio would tell a tidy version to those who asked, but the line that would persist would be compact and costly, a compliment that priced itself in consequence. And by evening, when chandeliers rehearsed their gossip again, the room that had mocked her would discover that some stories shrink in light and others develop, and that daylight had taken sides without raising its voice. The library had been built for thinking that prefers to be heard rather than explained, a high-ceilinged quiet, where the rain could be counted against window panes, like a clock that refuses to lie about time. She entered without escort and let the door take its own hinge, listening to how the latch accepted its job without drama. Some closures are not refusals, but completions, and she liked rooms that knew the difference. Shelves rose like patient ranks, leather spines keeping promises without polishing them, which is what she trusted about books. They do not flatter. They only ask to be opened and, sometimes, returned more carefully than they were taken. She chose a table where the light declared itself plainly and the rain's tempo steadied her inhale-exhale, the pacing she favored when rooms demanded she hurry for their benefit. He paused just inside, confirming that his presence would not rename the hour, then crossed at a pace set by rain rather than rank, and the room admitted him as if it expected exactness. He did not offer an arm or a chair. She did not invite or forbid either, letting the distance between them represent what it meant. Two adults, testing whether proximity can be built from attention instead of theater. On the table lay a book with a spine repaired by careful stitching, damage turned into proof of use. And he traced the seam with his eye, as if learning her ethics in linen thread. "The rain is punctual," he said, a good first sentence for a library, and the line oriented time without stealing the topic from the person who had earned it. "Punctuality is mercy when a day requires spine," she replied, tapping the repair once, a small sign readable by anyone fluent in thrift and patience. They spoke of bindings and margins, how paper thins where the eye returns, how annotations can be arrogant or tender, depending on whether they leave room for the next reader. respect either decorative or structural. He set a blank slip on the table like a key, not yet cut. Some pages require markers, and some moments require something that will outlast a glance. Then he left it harmless and less invited. She opened to a chapter on steering without stars and turned the page calmly. Modeling how to survive rooms that confuse speed with importance. Do you prefer arguments or proof sense, he asked, the kind of question that reveals more than praise. And she chose questions that remain good, even after answers make them unfashionable. Silence thickened as the rain did, a fullness, not an absence, and he placed a line as carefully as a craftsman sets a mortise, aware joints fail when forced. If a room assigns you a posture that does not fit, I can stand beside without reaching ahead, he said, a sentence finished at the moment of making, not a pledge asking to be graded. She let it rest long enough to test its weight, then nodded once, a contract measured in breath, committing without dramatizing commitment. They read to the end of the page and did not pretend to go further. She slid the blank slip to the margin of the passage about steering without stars. And the page and the promise were marked without theatre. A servant entered and stopped 2 steps in, unsure whether silence belonged to anyone. The Duke's hand lifted only as high as necessary to let the man know the room belonged to its work first. "Shall I return later, Your Grace?" the servant asked. "When the rain thins," he said, solving what was present without inviting what was not. Alone again, she rested her palm over the repaired spine, an idle sheltering that said more about her ethics than speeches do. He did not praise it. Knowing praise often breaks what it admires. "You weren't thanked yesterday," she said in a tone that would not be mistaken for payment. "Some acts break if reimbursed," he answered, and the shared half-smile held. They studied a cabinet of keys meant for household correspondence, amused at how doors claim to keep order when people do or don't, the small agreement too satisfying for its size. At the far end, a mirror angled toward an inner window stole light instead of granting it. She adjusted it by 2 degrees, correcting a theft no one else would have noticed. He watched and understood why compliments rarely reached her. Intact. They arrived at the wrong incidents, reflecting the wrong subject. She had grown unhurried about teaching people where to stand if they wished to see. He stepped close only enough to discover his shadow crossing her page, then stepped back, an absurd courtesy that outweighed a dozen gallant speeches. "I'm told my position obliges me to step ahead," he said. "Obligation often comes from those who benefit when I mistake height for wisdom," and her breath became a laugh she could keep. Outside, rain softened to a finer stitch, sewing the afternoon together without insisting on a pattern. She considered how few rooms help sew people up again. He wrote 4 words on the slip like a carpenter writes measurements he must not forget, then set it where it could be read or ignored without penalty. Beside, not ahead. She returned the slip to the book and closed the cover as if to seal something that would need reopening soon. Proper promises prefer to stay near the hand, not locked away from it. A hall clock chimed with the seriousness of objects that keep their jobs. The chime told them the day would soon require a public version of what had been agreed in private. They chose to answer such tests by altering tempo rather than volume. Arrive on time, say only what is needed, leave no trace a careless narrative can hoist like a trophy, discipline harder than it sounds. At the door, his hand hovered near the handle, not to usher but to keep the wood from catching her sleeve, and the choreography proved more than oaths ever could. She stepped through first, because the corridor belonged to her pace, while the room belonged to the book. He followed at the half-step. They would alternate in tight spaces without keeping score. A footman hurried up with a folded paper that had not been wet by rain, trouble already indoors and dressed, for company, and asked whether it should be left on the table. "Where truth keeps better," the Duke said, meaning wood, not hands, and the sheet lay unbroken, light with the kind of heaviness newspapers take on when they carry a rumor that will outrun a correction. They did not open it, and they refused the nobility of not opening it. Instead, she set the repaired spine book on top, making a point only they needed to read. Use can cover noise. He nodded once and held the door at a safe distance. The library receiving the arrangement with the practical grace of rooms that respect cause and effect. In the corridor, conversation gathered like water against a stone. The day tilted toward evening, and the chandeliered rooms began to warm their gossip. But the book, the slip, and the unopened fold had already installed a different rehearsal in 2 minds. They walked toward that rehearsal with the quiet stubbornness of people choosing accuracy in a city that rewards speed and the rain, work. Done thin to air, the most patient substance anyone breathes. Lady Harrow's reception arranged its guests the way tidy sentences arrange clauses, by rank first, meaning later, and by the time the first tray circled, the chandelier had already chosen whom to hear and whom to translate into rumor. She entered at a measured pace that required the evening to earn her attention, and the room did its arithmetic, adding what people wore to what they wanted and subtracting what they were. A constellation of matrons pivoted as one, pearls ticking like patient clocks, and space opened for the Duke not because he insisted, but because rooms with memory make room for discipline. He greeted the host without becoming entertainment and allowed his gaze to find her as alignment, not claim, the same half-step the library had taught. On a side table lay a folded rumor sheet that someone had weighted with a vase, as if weight could be rented to truth, and conversation pressed against its edges the way shallow water tests a stone. A columnist in a forgiving cravat yawned for attention and murmured about a lady who mistakes conversation for currency, and the corner of the room bent toward him the way crowds bend toward weather they paid for. The host hesitated, permission enough, and the columnist let one sentence fall like cutlery into quiet. She has made a study of staying single and a market of being seen. Before the syllables chose their next host, the Duke entered the sentence as correction, not shield, tone unhurried and volume exact. Incorrect on both counts, and ill-composed besides. Competence is not a market and attention is not a debt. The columnist smiled the smile designed to survive correction and searched the host's face for aid, finding only a brace of embarrassment better tailored than his cravat. The Duke continued, balancing, not bruising. A person who chooses words carefully might be practicing the only courtesy that outlasts an evening. Rehearsed scandal is a hobby for idle hands. She did not touch his sleeve or his speech. The moment relied on being titled correctly, and at the mantel a charitable board member calculated whether respect cost more than rank. Invitations by the fire whispered their own arithmetic. The room, sensing revisions to future guest lists, quieted the way markets quiet when a number must be corrected in public. The host recovered the composure decent men store for emergencies and thanked the Duke for clarifying a misalignment, disowning a spectacle without prosecuting it. The violin shifted to a melody capable of hosting dignity. The columnist excused himself to be exact, which is what people say when they mean be smaller, and his departure left the air tasting more like water than sugar. The price posted itself by morning. One board seat postponed, 2 invitations rescinded, and a relative's letter pretending to be wisdom while counting other people's comforts. She traced the room once, correcting an angled mirror and a sconce at war with its own draft, quiet remedies that recorded the evening better than any column would. At the side table, the vase still weighted the folded sheet. Her calling card now rested on the vase, a small architecture of refusal that made even the flowers behave. A friend praised her forbearance. She declined the mislabel politely. She had arranged, not waited, and the friend filed the new word under chores worth learning. In the opened garden, the night proved more honest than the chandelier, and they measured their weather without apology. The rain had stopped. The night would hold. When they returned, someone had liberated the fold and discovered that words deprived of oxygen die quickly. The sheet attempted to matter and failed. A footman, careful with temperature, brought 2 glasses without audience, and the host allowed the evening to return to being a reception, a demotion everyone welcomed. At the door, the Duke received a card in a familiar hand that looked like advice and felt like a ledger. He tucked it away the way a craftsman tucks a splinter, until it can be removed with clean tools. She left as she had entered, leaving behind a corrected mirror and a sconce that kept better company with its flame. Deprived of easy arithmetic, the room counted itself more slowly. The night closed on a truth the column could not print without praising what it disliked. Respect had spoken in complete sentences and been understood, and the cost had been paid in credible currency. By dawn, invitations would be lighter by a name, a board, shy a chair, and a household deciding whether library, garden, and reception together could teach a city how to handle a promise that refuses to perform. Evening pressed a last sheen onto the season, as if polish could delay conclusion, and the chandelier repeated the room's old stories in light, the way people repeat them in words when they hope repetition will pass for proof. She entered at the hour that asks a room to begin without her, and succeed anyway. and the entrance taught the heir to stop budgeting her as spectacle and start budgeting her as fact, which is the more expensive category. He arrived later, accurate rather than dramatic, and the path that opened was not a corridor for triumph, but a straight visible decision to keep faith with the pace that had served gardens, libraries, and receptions where arithmetic had to be corrected aloud. The column had printed a sourness at dawn and discovered by dusk that sourness does not scale under light. Folded copies fanned themselves in restless hands, busy work for people who prefer posture to purpose. The host, a recent student of furniture, greeted them with the modest relief of a man who has moved mirrors and sconces to their proper places and would like the evening to confirm that things can remain where they belong. Music began that could carry dignity without tripping it. No trills to tempt unkindness into thinking itself clever, only a measure steady enough for adults to keep their agreements while the room watched itself being taught. He crossed to her with the pace that keeps choices legible, the difference between walking to be seen and walking to be read, and the path recorded itself more permanently than any flourish could have under all that glass. "Will you join me for the first?" he asked, phrasing neither an entitlement nor an apology, a sentence sized to fit two people and audible to anyone borrowing ears for sport. She accepted with a chin that belongs to its bearer and a hand that does not rehearse softness for spectators, and the pair that formed persuaded the orchestra to play as if the figures had always been instructions, not decorations. Approach without enclosing, retreat without abandoning, return without claiming. The floor relearned its grammar, while the room tried to decide whether it preferred to be entertained or corrected, a choice it never enjoys making when the correction is quiet. On the second figure, he spoke a sentence sized for truth and sized against theatre. "Your work has changed the rooms I occupy. I prefer them this way." And the line was exactly long enough to survive cleaning and exactly short enough to instigate it. She answered with the sentence that refuses both triumph and discount. Rooms endure when people maintain them, and the agreement installed itself like a runner in a hallway, quieting footfall and guiding pace without announcing itself to guests who do not listen. By the door, a cousin tried a half apology that wanted to buy proximity with cosmetics, and she declined with thanks that named the product correctly, sending the cousin away in search of a mirror more willing to lie. A pair of matrons tallied prospects and discovered the ledger had changed currencies while they were counting pearls, which is the hazard pearls have always presented to arithmetic that dislikes evidence. The orchestra, grateful for a task better than ornament, carried them through a turn that aligned faces and responsibilities without welding either, and in that alignment, his posture matched the slip in his pocket without his hand needing to touch it. A gentleman near the threshold attempted a historical lecture about customs and seasons. The host, enjoying the new placement of his furniture, guided him into a chair that had learned at last where it belonged, and the lecturer sat down with him, domesticated. They finished the set without discovering a new trick, and with more new order than the room preferred to acknowledge, because new order announces itself rudely, and then, if allowed, begins the long work of becoming ordinary. He did not detain her with futures. She did not exam him with errands. They parted to their corners in the same arrangement that had moved a charity's tables and a column's appetite, trusting the work to remain visible without constant pointing. A messenger arrived for the host, whose face moved through alarm, calculation, and relief before settling on the expression that means the furniture will stay put, and the card he carried returned a postponed seat to circulation with its conditions written smaller than yesterday. The host returned the seat to the Duke with fewer instructions, which is how conditions confess defeat when they cannot afford the ceremony of apology, and the acceptance did not change his posture, because chairs are chairs, not crowns. She stood with a woman new to the city and taught her how to keep a card without letting it keep her, curriculum the room did not deserve and therefore required, and two eavesdroppers missed their step, trying to overhear what could be learned by participation only. He used the next set to speak with people he had previously overlooked on purpose, and did it without announcing his virtue, an efficiency that made the chandelier feel slightly underemployed, which is a step toward reform in any room. By the sideboard, the chairwoman spoke of coal with a man who had at last learned to hear numbers as sentences. The reading room ledger acquired an anonymous donor who understood that anonymity is correct only when it does not wink. Between dances, he met her near the corridor that leads to cold air, where words behave. And the corridor received them without asking for credentials, because results have a way of pre-authorizing entries. "I will be at the reading room each market morning," he said. "If a door needs learning, I will be there to help it learn." And the promise fitted the hinge of the life they had built line by line, modest as a tool, exact as a joint. "The key arrives at dawn," she said, producing not a symbol, but a brass thing shaped for work, restrained shine of objects that intend to last. And she placed it in his hand before taking it back, the choreography stating the settlement better than a speech about ownership would. They returned to the floor, not as a pair that must advertise itself at every turn, but as two participants in a room they had helped teach. And the floor did not object, because floors prefer balance to biography when given the choice. A cousin of the columnist tried to refresh the morning's sourness and discovered it would not dissolve in evening light. Words deprived of oxygen earlier had not revived during the day, and the attempt wilted without assistance from anyone's outrage. When the evening turned toward exits, the room did its old arithmetic one last time and found itself short a digit it had once counted on casually, which is how reform feels from inside, an absence that refuses to return even when called by familiar names. He approached but did not offer an arm. Instead, he matched her pace toward the outer door, where the hinge made the quieter sound it had learned since the season began. Oil where there had been grit, maintenance where there had been myth. They did not kiss because some endings are foundations and some are curtains, and this one preferred load-bearing to drapery. The chandelier, unable to applaud accuracy, did what light can do when it is honest and only that. On the step he lifted his hand, then lowered it before the gesture could become ushering, and she said nothing in a way that preserved the value of his decision by refusing to convert it to spectacle with praise. He left by a route that allowed the city to see him without arranging witnesses, discipline that allows rooms to trust what they have learned when the teacher is absent, which is the only test worth passing in public. She went home by a road that had acquired the habit of not offering advice. Streets learn too, when they host people who spend their steps on work rather than display, and the pavement kept her pace without comment. By dawn, the reading room door accepted the key like a sentence welcomes its verb, and the latch answered with the crispness of hardware that has been corrected and will now return the courtesy daily. She wrote the first line in the ledger: weather, attendance, questions asked, doors opened and closed without commentary, and the line taught the next one how to behave, which is what good books do for their neighbors on the shelf. He arrived at the hour he had promised, carrying neither announcement nor apology, and tested the hinge twice, once for sound, once for memory, the way craftsmen test their work when they intend it to become habit rather than achievement. A woman left a book with a cracked spine that deserved repair, and he set it gently where repair is done by hands that remember the difference between firmness and hardness. Lesson the studio had written into his day some mornings ago. A boy tried to bring a rumor under his coat and discovered the reading room misfiles such things by design, pressing flimsy slips into stillness beneath the weight of pages arranged by people who prefer use to noise. At noon, the chairwoman stopped by without entourage, looked at the coal account like a mother looks at a sleeping child, and left with nothing to announce, because not all victories are fit for trumpets, even when they are the only ones that last. He and she spoke briefly about timetables and keys, about alternating the half-step in corridors too narrow for two, about leaving errors visible until repaired, so future readers would not inherit damage mislabeled as design. When he left, he did so by the door that had learned the clean sound, and when she stayed, she did so by the table where questions arrived with their hats in their hands. The division of labor they had chosen, before rooms knew how to name it without malice. If anyone asked how the most desired duke fell in love with a woman, a room had once mocked. The answer was not legend or loophole, but a ledger, of doors taught and hinges oiled, of keys shared and returned, of sentences that did their jobs until worn smooth by honest hands.